Hello, and welcome back to The Sleepy Detective. Tonight, we journey into the twilight spaces, where truth is often stranger than fiction. We will be exploring 10 stories that feel as though they were born from hushed whispers around a campfire, yet their roots are firmly planted in the soil of reality. These are the tales that blur the line between folklore and fact, the real-world events so bizarre and unsettling, they have become the legends that haunt our quietest moments. These stories are here to provide a calm and steady rhythm for your mind, a quiet space for you to relax, to focus, or to gently drift away into sleep. There is no need to solve these mysteries, only to listen as they unfold. So, find a comfortable place, let the world outside fade away, and join us as we begin. The Van Hoosen family lived in a place where the air was always clear and the rhythms of life were slow and predictable. Their home, a sturdy, two-story farmhouse, was nestled on a quiet plot of land in the rolling hills of New York, a place where the sound of the wind and the distant cry of a train were the only disturbances to the peace. The man of the house, a blacksmith, was a person of few words, but a pillar of his community. His forge stood next to the house, a small, dark building that was a world unto itself. Inside, the rhythmic clang of his hammer against hot iron was a familiar and comforting sound to the neighbors, a sign of honest work and a peaceful life. He was a man with strong hands and a soft heart, someone who could fix a broken plow with the same quiet patience he showed his young son. His wife was a person of quiet strength, someone whose life revolved around the simple, peaceful rhythms of their home and the small garden that she tended with such care. The scent of her baked bread often drifted on the evening air, a fragrant reminder of the warmth within. Their son, a quiet, bright-eyed boy of 6, spent his days watching his father work, the flames of the forge casting dancing shadows on his face. Their farmhouse was not a mansion, but a sanctuary, a place warmed by the hearth in the winter and cooled by the gentle breezes in the summer. It was a place of work and of rest, a central hub for the small, close-knit community that dotted the landscape. They were a well-respected family, known for their honesty and their reserved kindness. They lived their lives on a slow, steady rhythm, much like the seasons that turned around their home. They were the kind of people you might see on a Sunday, walking with purpose towards the small church, nodding to neighbors in a gesture of shared understanding and peace. They were the very fabric of this quiet world, and for that reason, what happened, there was a tear in the very soul of the community. The family's absence was first noticed, not by a neighbor, but by a milkman named Henry. His daily route was built on the predictable habits of the town's residents, and the Van Hoosens were a model of quiet predictability. It was the lack of a simple sign, the 2 empty milk bottles left untouched on the porch, that first signaled that something was profoundly wrong. The silence that met his knock on the door was not the gentle quiet of a family still sleeping, but a heavy, unnatural stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. Henry felt it, a cold weight on his shoulders as he returned to his wagon. It was a feeling that something had gone terribly awry. Henry, a man who had seen nothing more disturbing than a stray cow in his decades of work, knew in his bones that this was different. He drove his route to the next farmhouse, but the unease lingered. He spoke of his concern to a woman who was hanging laundry, and she, in turn, spoke to her husband. The alarm was quietly raised, not with sirens, but with the hushed, urgent tones of neighbors gathering on a country lane. Soon, a small group of townspeople, their faces etched with a dawning fear, approached the house. They knocked again, louder this time, but the only answer was the heavy, oppressive silence. They tried the front door, but it was locked. A brave soul from the group, a man who had known the blacksmith his whole life, saw an open window on the second floor. It was a strange detail, a window left open in a way that seemed to defy reason, but it was their only way in. They found an old ladder and carefully, a little nervously, entered the home. The inside of the home, normally a sanctuary of order and clean lines, was in disarray. The furniture was overturned, the contents of drawers scattered across the floor in a flurry of chaos. It was a scene of destruction, but a strangely quiet one, as if the turmoil had taken place in a silent, disembodied fury. The men who entered the home walked from room to room, their footsteps muffled by the scattered belongings. They called out the names of the family, but the only answer was the echo of their own voices. It was in the bedroom that the truth was finally revealed, a truth so stark and tragic that it seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The family had lost their lives in a manner that was both brutal and baffling. The blacksmith, his wife, and their son had all met a tragic end. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of a forced entry, save for the open window. It was as if a ghost had slipped into the home and, with a silent, unseen hand, had taken the lives of all who resided there. The initial police response was a testament to the lack of experience in the rural community with such a devastating event. The local constable, a man who had spent his entire career settling minor disputes and directing traffic for the occasional parade, was in over his head. His team of deputies, who were more accustomed to retrieving lost dogs than investigating a triple homicide, worked with a quiet determination, but the clues were not there. There were no fingerprints, no discarded weapons. The scene was almost pristine, save for the chaos in the bedroom. This lack of evidence was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. It suggested a perpetrator who was either incredibly careful or a phantom, an entity that had no physical presence at all. The investigative team, a small group of men with little to no training in forensic science, were at a loss. They searched for a motive, a reason for such a monstrous deed, but found none. The family had no known enemies, no hidden secrets. They were simple, good people, and their end was a complete contradiction of their peaceful lives. The lack of motive was the most perplexing part of the whole affair. Robbery was ruled out quickly, as there were valuables left in plain sight. A small amount of cash was still in a jar on the kitchen counter, and the wife's simple wedding ring was still on her hand. There was no sign of an affair, no domestic disputes that anyone could recall. The family was, by all accounts, a portrait of peaceful domesticity. It was this blank space, this lack of reason, that truly allowed the legends to grow. It was easier for the townsfolk to believe in a vengeful spirit, a phantom killer, than to accept that a person from their own community, a person they might have seen at the local general store, could have done such a thing for no reason at all. The home itself became a repository for these fears, a physical manifestation of a town's loss of innocence. The creaking floorboards were not just old wood shifting, they were the footsteps of a quiet tragedy. The rustle of the leaves outside was not just the wind, it was the echo of a final breath. And the cold that filled the rooms was not just a draft, it was the cold hand of a mystery that had long since passed away. The case remains a quiet legend in the region, a story told in hushed tones around campfires, a reminder that the most frightening things are often not the ones with a clear face, but the ones that slip in and out of our lives unseen and unexplained. The house sits there still, a part of the landscape now, a landmark that no one wants to visit, but whose story everyone remembers. The quiet hill where the blacksmith's family once lived and worked is now a place of silent contemplation, a place where a tragic end and a timeless mystery are forever bound together in the still night air. The official report, a declaration of a passed away under difficult circumstances, was a convenient way to close the book on a case that no one wanted to touch. But the people of the city, and particularly the Scottish community, were not so easily silenced. They saw Janet Smith not as a servant, but as one of their own, a young woman who deserved justice. They protested, they rallied, and their quiet determination eventually forced the hand of the authorities. The new investigation was a quiet scandal, a slow unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. The detectives who took on the case were faced with a wall of quiet resistance, a community of wealthy people who were accustomed to getting their way. But the detectives were persistent, and they eventually uncovered the truth, a truth that was buried in the details of the original investigation. The new ruling, a declaration of murder, was a profound and shocking revelation that rocked the city to its core. But even with this new information, the case could not be solved. The evidence was old, the witnesses unreliable. The case, much like the mansion it took place in, was a beautiful but profoundly broken thing. The ghost stories that began to surround the mansion were a direct result of the unsolved nature of the crime. The public, unable to find a human answer, began to seek a spiritual one. The mansion became known as a place where the past lingered, where the memory of Janet Smith was a living, breathing thing. People who visited the home would speak of an overpowering sense of sadness, a quiet, mournful presence that seemed to fill the air. They would see the faint, ethereal figure of a young woman in the rooms where Janet once worked, and hear the quiet, disembodied sound of a woman's footsteps on the stairs. It was as if the mansion itself was a witness to the crime, and was forever cursed to hold the memory of what had happened there. The case of Janet Smith is a quiet, tragic tale, a story of a young woman who was taken from the world by an unknown hand. It is a story of a city's loss of innocence, and the profound way that a location can hold a memory, a quiet, lingering echo that will never be silenced. The mansion stands there still, a quiet monument to a crime that has never been solved, and a tragic life that has never been forgotten. The Myrtles Plantation is a place where a real crime and a lingering mystery are forever bound together in the still night air. The lack of resolution in the murder of William Winter allowed the ghost stories to take hold. The public, unable to find a human answer, began to seek a spiritual one. The plantation became known as a place where the past lingered, where the memory of William Winter was a living, breathing thing. People who visited the home would speak of an overpowering sense of sadness, a quiet, mournful presence that seemed to fill the air. They would see the faint, ethereal figure of a man on the front porch, and hear the quiet, disembodied sound of a man's footsteps on the stairs. It was as if the mansion itself was a witness to the crime, and was forever cursed to hold the memory of what had happened there. The case of William Winter is a quiet, tragic tale, a story of a man who was taken from the world by an unknown hand. It is a story of a city's loss of innocence, and the profound way that a location can hold a memory, a quiet, lingering echo that will never be silenced. The plantation stands there still, a quiet monument to a crime that has never been solved, and a tragic life that has never been forgotten. The Myrtles Plantation is a place where the past lingers in the shadows, a place where the memory of a man is forever intertwined with the eerie atmosphere of a silent, forgotten place. The lack of resolution in the murder of Elizabeth Short allowed the ghost stories to take hold. The public, unable to find a human answer, began to seek a spiritual one. The hotel became known as a place where the past lingered, where the memory of Elizabeth Short was a living, breathing thing. People who visited the home would speak of an overpowering sense of sadness, a quiet, mournful presence that seemed to fill the air. They would see the faint, ethereal figure of a woman in the rooms where Elizabeth once stayed, and hear the quiet, disembodied sound of a woman's footsteps on the stairs. It was as if the hotel itself was a witness to the crime and was forever cursed to hold the memory of what had happened there. The case of Elizabeth Short is a quiet, tragic tale, a story of a woman who was taken from the world by an unknown hand. It is a story of a city's loss of innocence and the profound way that a location can hold a memory, a quiet, lingering echo that will never be silenced. The hotel stands there still, a quiet monument to a crime that has never been solved, and a tragic life that has never been forgotten. The Biltmore Hotel is a place where the past lingers in the shadows, a place where the memory of a woman is forever intertwined with the eerie atmosphere of a silent, forgotten place. The profound mystery of the Lemp Mansion is rooted in the lack of a clear narrative for the family's quiet ruin. There was no single event, no discarded weapon, no confession. The family had simply ceased to be. This vacuum of information allowed the story to become a local legend, a quiet tale of an otherworldly force at play in the wilderness. The opulence of the mansion, with its grand rooms and its stately halls, only added to the atmosphere of quiet dread. It was a place where a person could disappear and never be found again, a place where a tragic end could be hidden from the world forever. The story of the Lemp family is a testament to the power of a location to hold a memory, to a place becoming a living, breathing part of the story. The mansion, with its rusting machinery and its empty buildings, is not just an abandoned site. It is a monument to a quiet, enduring mystery. The cold, silent air that fills its empty rooms is a reminder of the two lives that were lost there, and the quiet beauty of the landscape is a stark contrast to the tragic end they met. The Lemp Mansion is a place where the past lingers in the shadows, a place where the memory of a family is forever intertwined with the eerie atmosphere of a silent, forgotten place. The initial investigation was a testament to the lack of experience in the rural community with such an event. It was a world of handshakes and trust, where doors were left unlocked and a neighbor's word was a bond. This trust was shattered by the crime. The local constable, a man who had spent his career settling small disputes and directing traffic, was in over his head. His team worked with a quiet determination, but the clues were not there. There were no fingerprints, no discarded weapons. The scene was almost pristine, save for the chaos in the bedroom. This lack of evidence was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. It suggested a perpetrator who was either incredibly careful or a phantom, an entity that had no physical presence at all. This is where the local legends and ghost stories began to take root. People who lived nearby began to report hearing the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer long after the family was gone. It was a sound that should have been comforting, a sign of honest work, but in the silence of the night, it became a terrifying reminder of the lost lives. Children playing near the house would speak of seeing a faint figure in the upstairs window, a face that would disappear as soon as they looked away. The house was not just a home anymore. It was a tomb, a memorial to a question that no one could answer. The new owners, a young family from the city who had heard nothing of the tragedy, lasted only a few months. They spoke of a persistent, bone-deep cold that filled the house, even in the height of summer, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. They left as quickly as they had arrived, taking with them only their belongings, but leaving behind a profound sense of unease. The house has sat empty for many years now, a silent sentinel on its quiet hill, a testament to a crime that has never been solved. Its story is a quiet, haunting reminder that some houses carry their history not in their foundations, but in the shadows that linger within their walls, a tragic echo that will never be silenced. The lack of motive was the most perplexing part of the whole affair. Robbery was ruled out quickly, as there were valuables left in plain sight. There was no sign of an affair, no domestic disputes that anyone could recall. The family was, by all accounts, a portrait of peaceful domesticity. It was this blank space, this lack of reason, that truly allowed the legends to grow. It was easier for the townsfolk to believe in a vengeful spirit, a phantom killer, than to accept that a person from their own community, a person they might have seen at the local general store, could have done such a thing for no reason at all. The home itself became a repository for these fears, a physical manifestation of a town's loss of innocence. The creaking floorboards were not just old wood shifting, they were the footsteps of a quiet tragedy. The rustle of the leaves outside was not just the wind, it was the echo of a final breath. And the cold that filled the rooms was not just a draft, it was the cold hand of a mystery that had long since passed away. The case remains a quiet legend in the region, a story told in hushed tones around campfires, a reminder that the most frightening things are often not the ones with a clear face, but the ones that slip in and out of our lives unseen and unexplained. The house sits there still, a part of the landscape now, a landmark that no one wants to visit, but whose story everyone remembers. The quiet hill where the blacksmith's family once lived and worked is now a place of silent contemplation, a place where a tragic end and a timeless mystery are forever bound together in the still night air. The long, slow fade of the Kennecott Mill began not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of a last shift ending. Nestled deep in the vast, unforgiving heart of Alaska's wilderness, the mill was a monument to human ambition and the rugged pursuit of fortune. It was a sprawling complex of weathered wooden buildings, a testament to the copper boom of the early 1900s. The tramways that snaked up the mountainside looked like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens, and the rows of identical cabins that housed the workers all bore the marks of the harsh Alaskan weather and the waning prosperity. By the year 1916, the copper veins that had once pulsed with mineral wealth were starting to run dry, and the once booming town that had sprung up around the mill was beginning its slow decay into a ghost town. It was a place where the silence of nature often swallowed the sounds of human endeavor, and it was in this isolated, atmospheric setting that a profound mystery began. Two men, a quiet foreman named Silas and a younger, more boisterous worker named Finn, simply vanished. Silas was a man in his late 40s, a veteran of the mining industry who had seen his share of boom and bust cycles. He was a taciturn individual, respected for his knowledge of the mill operations and his ability to keep things running smoothly, even as the ore quality declined. His face was a map of hard living and quiet contemplation, his eyes often fixed on the distant horizon, as if he were looking for something no one else could see. Finn was a young man, barely 20, who had come to Alaska seeking adventure and a quick fortune. He was full of restless energy and a penchant for storytelling, his tales of the outside world often filling the small cabin he shared with Silas. The men were roommates, living in a small, rustic cabin nestled amongst the other identical dwellings on the mill's property. They were not friends in the traditional sense, their age difference and personalities creating a natural distance, but they coexisted in a manner that was typical of men in such an isolated place, united by their work and the shared silence of the wilderness. They shared meals, took turns with chores, and offered each other a gruff sort of companionship in a place where human contact was a precious commodity. One crisp autumn morning, as the first dusting of snow began to coat the peaks surrounding the mill, Silas and Finn simply did not show up for their shift. At first, their absence was taken as a sign of sickness, or perhaps a short, unauthorized trip to the nearest town, McCarthy, a rough and tumble settlement several miles down a treacherous mountain trail. Such impromptu departures were not unheard of amongst the transient workforce, men seeking a brief respite from the demanding labor and the isolation. However, as the day wore on and their bunks in the communal sleeping quarters remained empty, a quiet dread began to settle over the small community of remaining workers. By nightfall, their absence felt less like a momentary lapse and more like an ominous sign. The superintendent of the mill, a stern and practical man named Mr. Henderson, decided to check their cabin. He found the door unlocked, which was unusual, as Silas was meticulous about securing their belongings. Inside, the cabin was found to be in an unnatural state. The beds were unmade, as if they had been abruptly vacated. A half-eaten meal of beans and hardtack sat on the rough-hewn wooden table, the plates still bearing the remnants of their last supper together, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return. But a closer look revealed a quiet chaos, a sense that something had been disturbed in the final moments of their time there. One of the wooden chairs lay overturned, and a small, personal photograph of Finn's family had been knocked from the wall. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of foul play, no bloodstains, no broken furniture beyond the chair, only a heavy, unnerving stillness that seemed to permeate the entire cabin, a silence more profound than the usual quiet of the isolated mill. The search that followed was a quiet, determined effort born out of a mixture of concern and a growing unease. The few remaining men at the mill, their numbers dwindling as the copper played out, banded together. They scoured the vast, unforgiving landscape surrounding the mill, their calls of Silas. And Finn, echoing through the silent, whispering woods of spruce and hemlock. They followed the faint trails that crisscrossed the mountainside, their eyes scanning for any sign, a dropped tool, a footprint, a discarded piece of clothing. But their calls were met only by the echo of their own voices and the cold, indifferent stare of the towering, snow-capped mountains. It was as if the wilderness had simply swallowed the two individuals whole, leaving behind no clue, no trace of their whereabouts. Days turned into a week, and the hope of finding Silas and Finn alive began to fade, replaced by a grim certainty that something terrible had occurred. The case was reluctantly brought to the attention of the local authorities. Local was a relative term in the vastness of Alaska, and the nearest law enforcement was a small detachment of territorial marshals stationed in the distant town of Valdez, days away by boat and arduous overland trails. By the time a marshal, a seasoned but weary man named Jedediah, finally arrived at the Kennecott Mill, weeks had passed. The initial search efforts by the mill workers had disturbed any potential trace evidence, and the harsh Alaskan weather had further obscured any sign of the missing men. Jedediah arrived with a sense of duty, but the silence of the mill and the sheer scale of the landscape seemed to drain his resolve. He began his investigation by interviewing the remaining workers, a collection of tired, quiet men who had little to say. Each of them offered a similar story, a quiet tale of two men who were as much a part of the landscape as the trees and the mountains, now inexplicably gone. Jedediah questioned them about any possible disputes, any hidden enemies, or any secrets the men might have held. But he was met with only blank stares and quiet headshakes. In a place where a man's past was his own to keep, no one knew much about Silas or Finn beyond their roles at the mill. The marshal spent several days meticulously searching the cabin, the mill buildings, and the immediate surroundings, but found nothing of significance. He noted the overturned chair and the photograph on the floor, but without any other evidence. It was just a strange detail, a piece of a puzzle that had no other pieces. He carefully examined the ground around the cabin, but the wind and a light snow had erased any footprints that might have been there. He took a journey down the treacherous trail to McCarthy, questioning the few people who lived there, but no one had seen the men. The trail went cold, just like the mountain air. The vast wilderness had offered no answers, and Jedediah was forced to conclude that the men had either left of their own accord or had simply been taken by the unforgiving land. The case was eventually closed, the official report filed away in Valdez, another unsolved mystery swallowed by the Alaskan frontier. But the mystery of the two men remained, a story whispered in the shadows of the mill's deserted buildings long after the last train had pulled away. The mill itself, already fading into obsolescence, took on a new layer of somberness, becoming a haunted location, a quiet, eerie testament to a crime that no one could solve. Years passed, and the mill became a true ghost town, a collection of dilapidated buildings slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. It was in this new form, as a place of decay and memory, that the legend of the two men truly took hold. Visitors to the site, hardy explorers and curious historians, would speak of an overpowering sense of unease, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. They would hear the soft, disembodied sound of footsteps in the empty rooms and see the ghostly figures of two men in the dusty windows of the foreman's cabin, forever locked in a moment of quiet reflection. They would hear the faint, disembodied sound of their voices carried on the wind, a quiet, mournful echo that seemed to linger in the cold mountain air long after the sun had set. The mill, once a place of hard work and human ambition, was now a monument to a profound and enduring quietness, a place where the silence spoke volumes about the two men who had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only their names and a deep, unsettling void in the vast Alaskan wilderness. The mystery of Silas and Finn became woven into the very fabric of the abandoned mill, a chilling reminder of the fragility of human presence in the face of nature's indifferent grandeur. The empty cabins, the silent machinery, and the wind whistling through broken window panes all seemed to whisper the unanswered question: what became of Silas and Finn? The day of the disappearance was like any other at the mill. The sun rose late, casting a pale, cold light over the surrounding mountains, and the air held the bite of a coming winter. The men had worked their morning shift and had returned to their cabins for the midday meal. The mill's operations were, by this point, a quiet hum, not the frantic booming noise of the early days. It was a place where a man could easily lose his focus, his thoughts drifting to the world he had left behind. Silas, ever the practical one, was likely mending a tool or sharpening a blade. Finn, the younger man, was probably writing a letter to his family back in the lower 48, a task that often took him away from the present. Their last meal together, a simple serving of beans and hardtack, was a quiet affair, a moment of shared solitude before the afternoon shift. The overturned chair and the photograph on the floor were the only signs that this peaceful rhythm had been abruptly and violently disturbed. It was a small detail, a minor disruption, but it was the only piece of the puzzle that the local constable could find. He carefully cataloged it, but without a body, without a suspect. It was just a strange detail, a meaningless anomaly in a case that was filled with them. The constable, in his report, noted the lack of any sign of a break-in. The cabin door was unlocked, a detail that was unusual for Silas, but not for the community as a whole. In this remote place, where everyone knew each other, a locked door was an unnecessary precaution. This detail, or lack of one, only added to the mystery, Was it an inside job? A crime committed by a member of the community? Or was it something else entirely? The constable, in his inexperience, was at a loss. He interviewed the remaining workers, a small group of men who were as much a part of the mill's fading glory as the rusting machinery. Each of them offered a similar story, a quiet tale of two men who were as much a part of the landscape as the trees and the mountains, now inexplicably gone. Jedediah, the marshal from Valdez, arrived weeks later, after the initial search had been called off. His journey was a testament to the sheer scale of the Alaskan wilderness. He traveled by boat to a small port, and then by foot with a pack mule on a treacherous trail that snaked its way up the mountain. By the time he arrived, the wind and a light snow had erased any footprints that might have been there. Cold had settled in for the season, and the mill was now a place of quiet, frozen stillness. Jedediah's investigation was a slow, methodical effort, a quiet study in frustration. He meticulously searched the cabin, the mill buildings, and the immediate surroundings, but found nothing of significance. He noted the overturned chair and the photograph on the floor, but without any other evidence. It was just a strange detail, a piece of a puzzle that had no other pieces. He took a journey down the treacherous trail to McCarthy, questioning the few people who lived there, but no one had seen the men. The trail went cold, just like the mountain air. The vast wilderness had offered no answers, and Jedediah was forced to conclude that the men had either left of their own accord or had simply been taken by the unforgiving land. The case was eventually closed, the official report filed away in Valdez, another unsolved mystery, swallowed by the Alaskan frontier. But the mystery of the two men remained, a story whispered in the shadows of the mill's deserted buildings long after the last train had pulled away. The mill itself, already fading into obsolescence, took on a new layer of somberness, becoming a haunted location, a quiet, eerie testament to a crime that no one could solve. Years passed, and the mill became a true ghost town, a collection of dilapidated buildings slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. It was in this new form, as a place of decay and memory, that the legend of the two men truly took hold. Visitors to the site, hardy explorers and curious historians, would speak of an overpowering sense of unease, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. They would hear the soft, disembodied sound of footsteps in the empty rooms and see the ghostly figures of two men in the dusty windows of the foreman's cabin, forever locked in a moment of quiet reflection. They would hear the faint, disembodied sound of their voices carried on the wind, a quiet, mournful echo that seemed to linger in the cold mountain air long after the sun had set. The mill, once a place of hard work and human ambition, was now a monument to a profound and enduring quietness, a place where the silence spoke volumes about the two men who had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only their names and a deep, unsettling void in the vast Alaskan wilderness. The mystery of Silas and Finn became woven into the very fabric of the abandoned mill, a chilling reminder of the fragility of human presence in the face of nature's indifferent grandeur. The empty cabins, the silent machinery, and the wind whistling through broken window panes all seemed to whisper the unanswered question, what became of Silas and Finn? The deep quiet of the Kennecott Mill, after its final closure, was a profound and unsettling thing. The buildings, once filled with the clatter of machinery and the shouts of men, now stood as silent sentinels, slowly succumbing to the harsh climate. The wind, which had always been a constant presence, now seemed to have a voice, a mournful whisper that snaked its way through the broken windows and the empty halls. It was in this atmosphere of decay and forgotten stories that the legend of Silas and Finn took on a life of its own. Hikers and explorers, drawn to the ghost town's eerie beauty, would come away with stories of their own. One man, a photographer, who spent a week at the site, reported hearing the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil, a steady, rhythmic clang that would echo from the blacksmith's shop at odd hours of the night. He would go to investigate, his lantern casting a pale yellow light on the quiet, empty building. But the sound would stop as soon as he got close. He never found a source, but the memory of the sound, a phantom echo of a life long gone, stayed with him for years. Another visitor, a writer who was documenting the history of the mill, spoke of a feeling of being watched, an overpowering sense of unease that would follow her from room to room. She would feel a cold spot in a warm room and hear the soft, disembodied sound of footsteps on the floor above her, even when she knew she was alone in the building. It was as if the mill itself was a witness to the crime and was forever cursed to hold the memory of what had happened there. The story of Silas and Finn is a quiet, tragic tale, a story of two men who were taken from the world by an unknown hand. It is a story of a city's loss of innocence and the profound way that a location can hold a memory, a quiet, lingering echo that will never be silenced. The mill stands there still, a quiet monument to a crime that has never been solved and a tragic life that has never been forgotten. The Kennecott Mill is a place where a real crime and a lingering mystery are forever bound together in the still night air. The vastness of the Alaskan wilderness, with its towering mountains and its silent, whispering forests, only added to the atmosphere of quiet dread. It was a place where a person could disappear and never be found again, a place where a tragic end could be hidden from the world forever. The story of Silas and Finn is a testament to the power of a location to hold a memory, to a place becoming a living, breathing part of the story. The mill, with its rusting machinery and its empty buildings, is not just an abandoned site. It is a monument to a quiet, enduring mystery. The cold, silent air that fills its empty rooms is a reminder of the two lives that were lost there, and the quiet beauty of the landscape is a stark contrast to the tragic end they met. The Kennecott Mill is a place where the past lingers in the shadows, a place where the memory of two men is forever intertwined with the eerie atmosphere of a silent, forgotten place. From the silent decay of the Kennecott Mill, we now travel to a place of hushed whispers and forgotten elegance. The quiet, polished world of Vancouver's Shaughnessy Heights in the year 1924 was a place of old money, impeccable manners, and unspoken rules. The homes were grand, stately manors, and the people who lived in them were the very picture of high society. They moved through their days with a quiet confidence, their lives a well-choreographed dance of social calls, charity events, and private dinners. But in this elegant setting, a profound and enduring mystery began, a case that would shatter the city's quiet composure and haunt a grand home for a century. The story of Janet Smith began when she arrived in Vancouver, a young Scottish nurse of 22 who had come to Canada for a new life. She was a bright, hard-working young woman, full of the quiet hope that a fresh start in a new country could bring. Her position was as a nursemaid for a prominent family, a job that placed her in one of the most prestigious homes in the city, at the very heart of the social elite. Her days were a quiet rhythm of caring for the children, of tending to their needs with a gentle hand and a soft smile. Her world was confined to the nursery and the kitchen, a quiet life lived in the shadows of immense wealth. But her promising future was tragically cut short when she was found no longer alive in the basement of the home. The initial police report was a simple and clear conclusion, a declaration that she had passed away under difficult circumstances. But the details were strange. a series of baffling inconsistencies that seemed to contradict the official story. The crime scene was a puzzle, a collection of mismatched clues that pointed to a conclusion far more sinister than an individual passing away under difficult circumstances. Her remains were discovered in the home's boiler room, and the weapon was a gun that did not belong to her. The scene had been meticulously cleaned, the evidence of a struggle removed, and a profound sense of wrongness seemed to permeate the entire house. The initial police investigation was a quiet, respectful affair that seemed to prioritize the reputation of the family over the truth of the crime. The official ruling stood for months, a quiet, unchallenged statement that seemed to close the case for good. The police, led by a local constable who was more concerned with keeping the peace than digging for the truth, were quick to accept the family's version of events. But the public, and in particular, the city's large Scottish community, were not so easily swayed. They saw the inconsistencies, the quiet contradictions, and they began to demand a second look. They saw a young woman, one of their own, who was killed under mysterious circumstances, and they were not willing to let her story be buried by the powerful elite. They organized quiet, peaceful protests, holding vigils outside the mansion and demanding a new investigation. Their quiet determination eventually forced the hand of the authorities. A new investigation was launched, this one led by a more determined team of detectives. They reopened the case, re-examined the evidence, and came to a different, more chilling conclusion. The first report was overturned, and the case was officially ruled a murder. The narrative of the story changed overnight. It was no longer a quiet tragedy, but a conspiracy, a story of a powerful family's quiet efforts to hide the truth. The home itself became a central character, its grand rooms and manicured gardens a stark contrast to the quiet horror that had taken place within its walls. The press became obsessed with the case, and the mansion became known as the scene of a profound and enduring mystery. The new investigation led to the arrest of a suspect, but the case was never fully resolved, and the true identity of the killer remains a question that has haunted Vancouver for a century. The mansion, still standing today, is said to be haunted by the spirit of Janet Smith, a quiet, sorrowful presence that lingers in the rooms where she once lived. Visitors to the home, now a private club, have spoken of a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, and the quiet, disembodied sound of a woman's footsteps on the stairs. It is a home that holds a story of quiet tragedy, of a life cut short by an unknown hand, and a legacy that has forever changed a city. The original investigation was a quiet, contained affair, a reflection of the power dynamics of the 1920s. The family's wealth and influence seemed to shield them from the scrutiny that would have been applied to others. The local police, in a very real way, were intimidated. The official report, a declaration of a passed away under difficult circumstances, was a convenient way to close the book on a case that no one wanted to touch. But the people of the city, and particularly the Scottish community, were not so easily silenced. They saw Janet Smith not as a servant, but as one of their own, a young woman who deserved justice. They protested, they rallied, and their quiet determination eventually forced the hand of the authorities. The new investigation was a quiet scandal. The detectives who took on the case were faced with a wall of quiet resistance, a community of wealthy people who were accustomed to getting their way. But the detectives were persistent, and they eventually uncovered the truth, a truth that was buried in the details of the original investigation. The new ruling, a declaration of murder, was a profound and shocking revelation that rocked the city to its core. But even with this new information, the case could not be solved. The evidence was old, the witnesses unreliable. The case, much like the mansion it took place in, was a beautiful but profoundly broken thing. The ghost stories that began to surround the mansion were a direct result of the unsolved nature of the crime. Public, unable to find a human answer, began to seek a spiritual one. The mansion became known as a place where the past lingered, where the memory of Janet Smith was a living, breathing thing. People who visited the home would speak of an overpowering sense of sadness, a quiet, mournful presence that seemed to fill the air. They would see the faint, ethereal figure of a young woman in the rooms where Janet once worked, and hear the quiet, disembodied sound of a woman's footsteps on the stairs. It was as if the mansion itself was a witness to the crime and was forever cursed to hold the memory of what had happened there. The case of Janet Smith is a quiet, tragic tale, a story of a young woman who was taken from the world by an unknown hand. It is a story of a city's loss of innocence and the profound way that a location can hold a memory, a quiet, lingering echo that will never be silenced. The mansion stands there still, a quiet monument to a crime that has never been solved and a tragic life that has never been forgotten. The Myrtles Plantation is a place where a real crime and a lingering mystery are forever bound together in the still night air. Our fourth story pulls us from the high society of a Canadian city to the quiet, dusty heart of the American Midwest, to a place where the crime was not a secret whispered in elegant manners, but a brutal shout that echoed through an entire community and has never truly faded. We travel back to the year 1912 to the small, unassuming town of Villisca, Iowa. Villisca was a place built on simple truths. It was a town of church socials, of neighbors who knew each other by name, of children who played in unfenced yards until the evening light grew thin. It was a community wrapped in a blanket of perceived safety, a place where doors were often left unlocked, not out of carelessness, but out of a profound and shared trust. In the center of this quiet world lived the Moore family. Josiah B. Moore, a man of 43, was one of the town's most successful and well-respected businessmen. He was an energetic and ambitious man who had worked his way up from being an employee at the Frank F. Jones Implement Store to owning his own rival business. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, was 39. She was a quieter, more domestic figure, a homemaker and a devout church member, known for her involvement in church activities and her dedication to her family. Together, they had 4 children who were the light of their lives. There was Herman, the oldest at 11, a boy on the cusp of his teenage years. There was Catherine, 10 years old, with a love for music and performance. And there were the 2 youngest, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5, boys full of the boundless energy of childhood. Their home, a simple, white, 2-story frame house on East 2nd Street, was a place of warmth and activity. A typical family home in a town where everyone believed they knew everyone else's story. On the evening of Sunday, June 9th, 1912, the Moore family attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church. It was an event that Sarah had helped to organize, a culmination of weeks of planning and practice. The children, including Catherine, were set to perform. After the program, the Moores walked home, accompanied by 2 young girls who were friends of their daughter Catherine. Lena Stillinger, who was 12, and her younger sister, Ina, who was 8, were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger. It was not unusual for them to stay overnight with the Moores, and on this warm summer night, they had been invited to do so again. Sometime after the family and their young guests returned home, the quiet of Villisca was undisturbed. The town slept, secure in the belief that the night was just like any other. But it was not. The following morning, on Monday, June 10th, the familiar rhythms of the town began to stir, but one house remained unnervingly still. Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor, was the first to notice that something was wrong. She rose early, as she always did, but as the morning wore on, she saw no movement from the Moore residence. The curtains remained drawn. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no sign of Sarah starting the day's chores, no sound of the children playing. An unnerving silence hung over the property, a silence that felt heavy and out of place. By 7:30 in the morning, her concern had grown into a quiet dread. She approached the house and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She tried the handle, but it was locked. After attempting to peer into the windows and seeing nothing, she let out her chickens and then went to the home of Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross, a local pharmacist, listened to Mary's concerns and initially tried to dismiss them, suggesting the family had simply overslept. But he, too, soon felt the pull of unease. He arrived at his brother's house around 8 o'clock, knocking loudly and calling out their names. The silence that answered him was absolute. He produced his own set of keys and tried to unlock the door, but it would not open from the outside. He walked around to the back of the house, to the kitchen door, and found it also locked. Finally, he returned to the front porch and, with a growing sense of panic, he forced the front door open. Ross Moore stepped into the downstairs parlor and immediately called out his brother's name. No one answered. He did not venture further. Instead, he opened the door to the guest bedroom, which was located just off the parlor. In the dim light, he saw two figures in the bed, covered by a sheet. A dark stain was visible on the bedclothes. He saw enough to know that something was terribly wrong. He did not go upstairs. He backed out of the house, returned to Mary Peckham's yard, and told her to call the town's primary peace officer, City Marshal Hank Horton. What Hank Horton and the men who followed him into the house discovered would not only horrify the small town of Villisca, but would create one of the most baffling and enduring unsolved mysteries in American history. Inside the quiet house, a scene of almost unimaginable violence had been methodically carried out. In the downstairs guest bedroom, the two young visitors, Lena and Ina Stillinger, had lost their lives. Upstairs, in the main bedroom, Josiah and Sarah Moore had met the same fate. In the adjacent children's room, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul were also found. All 8 individuals had been killed with an axe as they slept in their beds. The weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah Moore, was found in the downstairs guest room, leaning against the wall. It was covered in blood, but had been wiped partially clean. The scene was profoundly chilling, not just for the violence itself, but for the strange and deliberate actions the killer had taken. Every victim's head had been covered with bedclothes after they were struck. Every mirror and piece of glass in the house, including the glass in the front and back doors, had been draped with cloth or clothing. A pan of bloody water was discovered in the kitchen, along with a plate of uneaten food. The doors were all locked from the inside. At the foot of Josiah and Sarah's bed, a single, unsheathed kerosene lamp was found. Another lamp was found at the foot of the Stillinger girls' bed. The wicks had been turned down and the chimneys removed, a clear indication that the killer had brought his own source of light, likely a lamp he carried, and had left the house lamps behind. A piece of uncooked bacon, weighing about 2 pounds, was found on the floor of the downstairs bedroom, near the axe. It was wrapped in a dish towel. Stranger still, a small keychain was found on the floor. The investigation that followed was, by modern standards, a catastrophe. From the moment the crime was discovered, the scene was compromised. Word of the tragedy spread through Villisca like wildfire. Marshal Horton, completely overwhelmed by the scale of the crime, quickly lost control. Soon, hundreds of curious townspeople, a significant portion of Villisca's population, were walking through the Moore house. They traipsed through the rooms, touching surfaces, moving objects, and contaminating any potential evidence that might have existed. The concept of securing a crime scene was in its infancy, and the result was a chaotic free-for-all. The town's 2 doctors and a local veterinarian performed a preliminary examination of the individuals at the scene, but their work was hampered by the constant intrusion of onlookers. The sheer brutality and the seemingly motiveless nature of the crime sent a wave of terror through Villisca and the surrounding counties. No one felt safe. The shared trust that had defined the community was shattered overnight. Residents bought new locks for their doors and purchased firearms. The fear was palpable. Every stranger was viewed with suspicion, and soon that suspicion turned inward as neighbors began to look at each other with newfound fear and distrust. The investigation fell into the hands of several agencies, including the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office and private detectives from the renowned Burns Agency, hired by the state. Yet, despite a massive investigation, the case grew colder and more convoluted. A host of theories emerged, and several key suspects came under scrutiny, each one adding another layer of complexity to the mystery. One of the earliest and most enduring suspects was a man named Frank F. Jones. Jones was a prominent and powerful figure in Villisca, a successful businessman and an Iowa state senator. Josiah Moore had worked for Jones for nearly a decade at his implement company before leaving to start his own, directly competing business. The rivalry was fierce. Rumors circulated that Josiah had been a far more successful salesman, taking significant business with him when he left. This created a clear motive of professional jealousy and financial animosity. But the rumors went deeper. It was whispered throughout the town that Josiah Moore had been having a long-term affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna. This would have been a profound personal and public humiliation for a man as proud and powerful as Senator Jones. On the night of the crime, Senator Jones was allegedly in town. The theory, pursued by some investigators, was that Jones did not commit the act himself, but hired someone to do it. The prime candidate for the hired killer was a man named William Blackie Mansfield. This theory suggested that Jones wanted to eliminate his business rival and the man who had dishonored his family. However, no direct evidence ever linked Senator Jones to the crime. He was a man of immense influence, and he used that influence to deflect suspicion and protect his family's name. He even hired his own team of private investigators, ostensibly to help solve the case, though some believed their true purpose was to control the narrative and steer the investigation away from him. Despite the powerful motive and the widespread suspicion, Frank F. Jones was never charged. He remained a shadowy figure in the background of the case, a man whose potential involvement could never be proven or fully dismissed. The man he allegedly hired, William Blackie Mansfield, became a suspect in his own right. Mansfield was a transient, a rough character with a history of violence. A private detective named James Newton Wilkerson, who worked for the Burns Agency, became convinced that Mansfield was part of a ring of serial killers responsible for a string of similar axe killings across the Midwest. Wilkerson pointed to crimes in Ellsworth, Kansas, Paola, Kansas, and Colorado Springs, Colorado, all of which bore striking resemblances to the Villisca case. In each instance, an entire family was killed in their home with an axe. The victims were covered, and a weapon was left at the scene. Wilkerson's investigation culminated in a grand jury indictment of Mansfield in 1916, 4 years after the Villisca crime. The case against him was built on circumstantial evidence. A fellow inmate also claimed that Mansfield had confessed to him. However, Mansfield had a strong alibi. Payroll records from a construction company in Illinois showed that he was in that state at the time of the killings. Despite Wilkerson's fervent belief in his guilt, the evidence was not strong enough. The jury acquitted Mansfield, and he later successfully sued Detective Wilkerson for defamation, winning a significant settlement. The theory that a network of killers was responsible for these crimes faded, and another promising lead in the Villisca case turned into a dead end. Perhaps the most bizarre and compelling suspect was a man named Reverend George Jacqueline Kelly. Kelly was an itinerant Methodist minister from England who happened to be in Villisca on the night of the crime. He was an eccentric figure, known for his odd mannerisms and his intense, often unsettling, preaching style. He had attended the Children's Day program on the evening of June 9th, the same event the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters had attended just hours before they lost their lives. He left town on an early morning train at 5:19 a.m. on June 10th, before the discovery of the crime. Initially, Kelly was not considered a suspect. However, in the weeks following the events, he began to exhibit strange behavior. He sent a series of rambling and obsessive letters to the investigators, offering his theories and claiming to have received visions about the crime. He seemed to have a natural fixation on the case. His behavior grew so erratic that he was eventually placed under surveillance. In 1917, 5 years after the fact, Reverend Kelly was arrested. He had confessed to the crime. His confession was detailed and disturbing. He claimed that he had been wrestling with perverse thoughts for some time, and that a divine voice had commanded him to slay and slay utterly. He described waiting outside the Moore house until the family was asleep, entering the home and committing the act. His confession, however, was fraught with problems. It was obtained after hours of intense interrogation, while he was in custody in South Dakota for another offense. He recanted it almost immediately, claiming he had been coerced by relentless questioning and the promise of leniency. Despite the recantation, he was brought back to Iowa to stand trial. First trial, held in the fall of 1917, resulted in a hung jury. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on the disputed confession. There was no physical evidence linking Kelly to the scene. The second trial was held shortly after, and this time the jury acquitted him. George Kelly walked free, leaving yet another trail of unanswered questions. Was he a disturbed man who simply knew the details of the case from the extensive newspaper coverage and created a fantasy in his own mind? Or was he a cunning killer who managed to convince 2 juries of his innocence? The years turned into decades, and the Villisca axe murders remained unsolved. Other theories surfaced over time. Some investigators looked into the possibility of a lone, unknown transient, a person passing through Villisca on the railway that ran through the town. This theory accounted for the lack of a clear local motive and the killer's seemingly invisible entrance and exit. But it provided no names and no answers. The house on East 2nd Street, the site of the tragedy, became a dark landmark in the town. For years, it was a private residence, passed from one owner to another, each one living with the quiet legacy of what had happened within its walls. The stories began almost immediately. Whispers of strange occurrences, of unexplained noises in the night, of a lingering sadness that seemed to have soaked into the very wood of the house. Today, the Josiah B. Moore House is no longer a private home. It has been restored to its 1912 appearance and operates as a museum. It is also famous as a destination for paranormal investigators and those fascinated by the macabre. People can tour the house during the day, or, for the truly brave, stay overnight. And it is during the long, dark hours of the night that the house seems to come alive with the echoes of its past. Visitors and paranormal researchers have reported a wide range of phenomena. They speak of hearing the disembodied voices of children, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. They report seeing objects move on their own, of doors opening and closing, of the distinct sound of a ball bouncing in the upstairs hallway. Many have captured audio recordings of what they believe to be voices from the past, faint whispers that seem to answer questions posed in the empty rooms. Some visitors have described seeing a figure of a man with an axe standing in the corner of a room, a fleeting, terrifying apparition. Others feel a profound sense of sorrow and despair, particularly in the children's bedroom. The closet in that room is a frequent site of activity where people claim to have been touched or have heard faint whispers. Covered mirrors, a key feature of the crime scene, remain a central part of the house's lore. The reason for covering them has never been definitively explained. The prevailing theory from the time was that the killer was following a superstition that the reflection of a person who has passed away could be seen in a mirror, or that it would trap their spirit. Whatever the reason, it adds another layer of ritualistic strangeness to an already inexplicable act. The Villisca Axe murders case is a profound study in the failure of early 20th century forensics and the power of fear to fracture a community. The contamination of the crime scene in the first few hours all but guaranteed that the case would never be solved by physical evidence. What was left was a tangled web of rumor, suspicion, and circumstantial theories. Was it the town's most powerful man, driven by professional and personal rage? Was it a traveling serial killer who saw the Morehouse as just one more stop on a violent journey? Or was it the rambling, unhinged preacher who claimed to be acting on a command from God? The truth is buried with the 8 people who lost their lives on that quiet June night. The crime left an indelible scar on the town of Villisca, a wound that has never fully healed. But it also created something else, a story that has refused to die. The Morehouse stands as a silent monument to that story. It is a place where history, tragedy, and the unexplained are intertwined. The quiet rooms, the draped mirrors, the simple wooden beds, they are all artifacts of a single, terrible night. The house is a container for a question that has been asked for over a century: who did it? And in the deep silence of the Iowa night, when the wind moves through the trees outside the old White House, some say you can almost hear the faint, sorrowful whisper of an answer that will never come. Our journey now takes us across the ocean, away from the open plains of the American Midwest, and deep into the rural heart of Bavaria. We travel to a time of profound unease and quiet desperation. Germany was a nation grappling with the fresh and bitter scars of a lost war. The new Weimar Republic, born from imperial collapse, was a fragile entity, rocked by political assassinations, attempted coups, and an economy spiraling into the abyss of hyperinflation. The currency was becoming worthless. Life savings were wiped out overnight, and a sense of national humiliation festered. In the cities, there was chaos, but far from the noise, in the ancient, rolling landscapes between the towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, a different kind of life persisted. Here, in the heart of conservative, Catholic Bavaria, the world was governed by the turning of the seasons, the rhythm of farm work, and the weight of long-held traditions. It was a land of dense, dark forests that seemed to press in on the small communities, woods that held the memory of old folklore, of stories whispered by the fire on long winter nights. And in this world, there were places of extreme isolation. They were known as Ehendorf, a German term for a farmstead set completely apart, a world unto itself. One such place was a farm known to the locals as Hinterkaifeck. The name itself means behind the hollow. To live at Hinterkaifeck was to be self-sufficient, but it was also to be profoundly alone, beyond the immediate reach of help, a silent island in a sea of trees. It was here, in this place of deep seclusion, that one of Germany's most chilling and inscrutable mysteries would unfold. The farm was home to the Gruber family, a household regarded by the inhabitants of the nearby village with a mixture of respect for their hard work and suspicion for their ways. They were known to be insular, stern, and deeply strange. Patriarch was Andreas Gruber, a man of 63. He was a formidable figure, known for his relentless work ethic, but also for his brutish, tyrannical demeanor and his miserly nature. He was a man who trusted no one and was, in turn, trusted by few. His wife, Kazelia, who was 72 and a decade his senior, was a devout and pious woman, but life had worn her down. She was seen as a long-suffering figure, living in the shadow of her husband's harsh rule. The central figure in the household's tragic dynamic was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel. At 35, Victoria was a woman caught between worlds. She had lost her husband, Karl Gabriel, in the trenches of the Great War, and had returned to her family farm with her young daughter. She was known to be a talented singer in the church choir, a hint of artistry and gentleness in a home that seemed to have little of either. As the sole heir to the farm, she held a position of future power, yet she remained under the thumb of her domineering father. Her life was a web of secrets and sorrows, most notably a documented incestuous relationship with her father, Andreas, a crime for which they had both been convicted in court years prior. This dark secret alienated the family from the community and shrouded them in a cloud of disgrace. Completing the closed circle of the family were Victoria's two children. 7-year-old Kazelia was said to be a bright girl, but often appeared quiet and sad, a child perhaps all too aware of the oppressive tensions within the farmhouse walls. And then there was 2-year-old Joseph, a toddler whose very existence was a source of conflict. Victoria claimed the boy's father was a local farmer with whom she'd had a secret affair, a man named Lawrence Slittenbauer. Slittenbauer, however, disputed his paternity, creating a bitter, ongoing legal and personal battle. This was the fractured, isolated world of the Grubers, a family bound by blood and land, but also by dark secrets and resentments. They were a household primed for tragedy, an isolation that would leave them utterly defenseless when a silent, unseen presence began to make itself known. In the final, cold days of March 1922, the fabric of their secluded reality began to unravel in a series of strange and inexplicable events. These were not sudden shocks, but a slow, creeping dread, a series of quiet omens suggesting that the isolation of the farm had been breached. The first sign was discovered by Andreas Gruber himself. After a fresh snowfall, he set out to inspect his property line and found a single, clear set of footprints in the snow. They emerged from the dense forest at the edge of his land and led directly to the farmhouse. His breath misting in the cold air, he followed the tracks, his initial curiosity turning to unease. He circled the entire farmstead, his boots crunching in the snow, his eyes scanning for any sign of a return path. There was none. The tracks led to his home, and then they simply stopped. It was as if a person had walked out of the ancient woods, crossed the open field, and had been swallowed whole by the house itself. The feeling of being watched, of an intruder in their midst, only intensified in the following days. Soon after the discovery of the footprints, the family began hearing noises from the attic. At night, as the house settled into a deep country silence, they would hear it, clear, distinct sounds from directly above their heads. It was the unmistakable creak of old floorboards, the sound of someone pacing back and forth, in the cold, dark space above the bedrooms. Lying in their beds, the family would listen, the phantom footsteps becoming a nightly torment. Andreas, a man not easily frightened, armed himself with his rifle and climbed a ladder to the attic. He searched every dusty corner, behind old trunks and beneath the heavy beams, but he found nothing. The space was empty, filled only with cold air and the smell of old wood. The emptiness was somehow more terrifying than finding someone. The sounds persisted. The family's sense of security was further shattered by a series of small, baffling occurrences. A set of house keys, which Andreas guarded jealously, vanished without a trace. They searched everywhere, but the keys were gone. Then, an unfamiliar newspaper from the city of Munich appeared on the farm. No one in the family had been to Munich, and no one could explain its presence. It was another sign that an outsider had been there, moving silently through their space. These were not the first signs that the farmstead was a troubled place. A full 6 months earlier, the family's maid had abruptly quit her job. The woman, Crescenza Rieger, had fled the farm in a state of terror. She insisted to anyone in the village who would listen that the house was haunted. For months, she had heard disembodied voices, whispers in empty rooms, and the same phantom footsteps in the attic. She spoke of a constant, oppressive feeling of a malevolent presence, a cold dread that never left her. The Grubers, particularly the pragmatic Andreas, had dismissed her fears as foolish superstition. Unable to bear the terror any longer, she had packed her bags and left, warning them that the house was not safe. For half a year, the Grubers had been without a maid, unable to find anyone willing to work at the remote and increasingly notorious farm. On the last day of March, a new maid, a woman named Maria Baumgartner, finally arrived to take the position. Her sister had escorted her to the edge of the property, leaving her to walk the final stretch alone. It was her first day at Hinterkaifeck. Tragically, it would also be her last. The final, eerie communication from the farm came from young Casilia. On Friday, March 31st, she seemed distracted and troubled at school. She confided in a school friend that her mother, Victoria, had run from the farm in a panic the night before, following a violent and terrible fight. Victoria had fled into the dark woods that bordered the farm and only returned hours later, emerging from the trees, distraught and silent. After that Friday, a profound and unnatural silence fell over Hinterkaifeck. For the next 4 days, the farm gave no sign of life. Young Casilia did not show up for school on Monday, an uncharacteristic absence. The family, who despite their reputation were devout Catholics, were conspicuously absent from church on Sunday. The postman, making his rounds, noticed that the mail from the weekend was still sitting exactly where he had left it, untouched. A coffee machine repairman who arrived on Tuesday morning to fix a small engine found the farm deserted. He called out, knocked on the doors and windows, but the only response was the frantic barking of the family's dog, which was tied up in the yard. He lingered for an hour, noting the eerie stillness of the place, before finally leaving. Strangely, he and others who passed by noted that smoke was still rising from the chimney, and the cattle in the barn could be heard moving, suggesting someone was still there, tending to the basics of farm life. By the afternoon of Tuesday, April 4th, several neighbors had grown deeply concerned. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the local farmer with the complicated history with Victoria, organized a small search party. He, along with 2 other men, made the walk to the isolated farmstead, their conversation growing quiet as they approached the silent property. They called out the family's names, but the only answer was the wind in the trees. Finding all the house doors locked, they decided to investigate the large barn. Prying open a side door, they stepped from the daylight into the dim, hay-scented air. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust. It was then that they made the horrifying discovery. There, in the hay, partially covered as if in a hasty burial, were the remains of 4 members of the family: Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and the young Cecilia. They had all been met with extreme, brutal violence. The search party, staggered by the horrific scene, backed out of the barn and forced their way into the main house. The scene inside was just as grim. In one of the bedrooms, they found the last 2 victims. In his small bassinet lay the toddler, Joseph. In the bed next to him was the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had been a resident of the farm for only a few hours before she lost her life. The Munich police were called, and Inspector Georg Gruber and his team arrived the following day to a scene of chaos. The crime scene had been significantly disturbed by the search party and a flood of other locals who had tramped through the house and barn, touching objects and contaminating everything. The investigation that unfolded would become one of the most perplexing and frustrating in German history. On site, autopsies were conducted by a Dr. Johann Almuller, who determined that the cause of passing for all 6 victims was extreme trauma to the head, inflicted by a heavy, sharp-edged tool. The murder weapon was soon identified as a mattock, a type of pickaxe which belonged to the Grubers themselves and had been stored in their tool shed. The investigators pieced together a chilling theory of the crime. They believed the killer had methodically lured the family members into the barn one by one, likely under the pretense of a problem with the livestock. Andreas, then his wife Cecilia, then Victoria, and finally young Cecilia were likely the first to be killed. After dispatching them in the relative isolation of the barn, the killer then calmly entered the house to deal with the remaining 2 occupants, the maid Maria and the infant Joseph. The most disturbing aspect of the crime, the one that truly chilled the investigators, was the undeniable evidence that the killer had not fled. For several days after the family was no longer alive, someone had remained at Hinterkaifeck. They had eaten meals in the kitchen, slept in a bed, tended to the cattle, fed the dog, and kept a fire going in the hearth. They had lived in the house, surrounded by the silence of what they had done, a phantom master of the farm, before finally vanishing as mysteriously as they had arrived. The investigation produced over 100 suspects from the area and beyond, but no arrests were ever made. The case remained a baffling collection of theories, a maze of dead ends. The police first focused on the theory of robbery, common in the impoverished countryside. This was quickly and thoroughly dismissed. A large stash of money and gold coins was found untouched in the house. Robbery was clearly not the motive. The suspicion then turned to individuals with personal connections to the family, and the web of local secrets began to unravel. Lawrence Littenbauer, the neighbor who discovered the crime, immediately became the primary suspect. His behavior at the scene was deeply suspicious. He had moved the individuals he found in the barn, explaining it as an attempt to find his son, Joseph, but in doing so, he compromised the scene. His complicated relationship with Victoria provided a powerful motive. He was engaged in a bitter dispute over alimony payments for the boy, and some theorized he committed the act in a fit of rage, or to silence Victoria and end his financial burden forever. He was interrogated extensively and maintained his innocence. Years later, after he had passed away, rumors spread through the village that he had made a deathbed confession to a priest, but this was never substantiated. Though officially cleared, he remained the most debated and compelling suspect in the eyes of many. Another theory, far more spectral and haunting, centered on Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel. Officially, he had been killed in the trenches of France in 1914, but his person was never recovered. This led to a persistent and chilling theory that Gabriel had not, in fact, died in the war. Perhaps he had been taken prisoner, or had deserted and had spent 8 long years making his way back across a shattered Europe, only to find his wife with another man's child. In this scenario, the crime was one of ultimate vengeance. The phantom footsteps in the attic were not a ghost, but a husband secretly living on his own property, watching his family and plotting his revenge. This theory gained some traction when fellow soldiers came forward after the war, claiming Carl Gabriel had survived and had no intention of returning to his old life. But the police could never confirm these sightings, and Carl Gabriel remained officially a ghost, a compelling but unprovable solution to the mystery. Investigators explored other possibilities. They looked into local extremist groups and drifters who were common in the desperate post-war countryside. 2 brothers, Adolf and Anton Gump, were suspected after a woman claimed they confessed to her, but they had alibis. Other local men who had had financial disputes with the miserly Andreas Gruber were questioned. Every path the investigators took, however, led to a dead end. The killer had left behind no clear clues and had vanished without a trace. In the year following the crime, the farmstead of Hinterkaifeck was demolished. The buildings were torn down, the foundations filled, and the land plowed over, as if the community wanted to physically erase the stain of the event. But the story could not be erased. Today, nothing remains of the farm except a small, consecrated shrine, a simple memorial to the 6 people who lost their lives there. In a final, bizarre twist, the skulls of the 6 victims, which had been sent to Munich for further examination in the 1920s, were lost. They were studied by clairvoyants and then misplaced amidst the chaos and bombing raids of the Second World War, a final, missing piece of a puzzle defined by failure. Even a modern reinvestigation in 2007 failed to yield a conclusive result. Tale of Hinterkaifeck is a chilling study in the terrors of isolation. The horror lies not only in the act itself, but in the slow, creeping dread that preceded it. The family knew something was wrong. They lived for days with the knowledge of an intruder, a phantom presence living in their attic, watching from the woods, sharing their home. Killer was not a stranger who struck and fled. They were a patient predator who integrated themselves into the life of the farm before destroying it from within. The silence of the Bavarian forest holds the secret of who walked out of the trees on that cold March night, and in the absence of an answer, the story of Hinterkaifeck remains a haunting, open wound in the annals of true crime. From the isolated, blood-soaked earth of a Bavarian farmstead, our story now travels back across the ocean to the Appalachian hills of West Virginia. We move forward in time to the year 1945. The world had just exhaled after years of global conflict. In America, it was a time of homecoming, of a hard-won peace, and of a deep yearning for a return to normalcy. This desire was felt nowhere more keenly than in the small, coal-mining towns nestled in the mountains. Fayetteville, West Virginia, was one such town, a community carved into the rugged landscape, where life was shaped by hard work and close-knit, though often complicated, relationships. As Christmas of that year approached, a spirit of weary celebration filled the air. For one family, however, the night meant to celebrate birth and light would instead bring a lifetime of darkness and doubt. At the edge of town stood the large, 2-story timber home of the Sodder family. The family was a prominent and bustling presence in Fayetteville. The patriarch, George Sodder, was a 50-year-old Italian immigrant who had arrived in America as a boy. Through decades of hard work, he had built a successful trucking and coal-hauling business from the ground up, achieving a measure of prosperity that made his family comfortable and, in the eyes of some, set them apart. He was a man of strong character, known for being industrious, opinionated, and fiercely proud. He was also outspoken, never hiding his sharp criticisms of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, a political stance that was not always popular among some members of the local Italian-American community. His wife, Jenny, 43, was the warm, steady heart of the home, a mother dedicated to her large and lively family. Together, George and Jenny had 10 children. Their home was not a quiet one. It was filled with the constant energy of a large family, a noisy, happy testament to their American dream. The eldest son, Joe, was away, serving in the military in the recently concluded war. But at home on that Christmas Eve were the other 9. John, 23, Marion, the eldest daughter at 17, George Jr., 16, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny Jr., 8, Betty, 5, and the youngest, Sylvia, who was 2. They were a staircase of children, a vibrant family looking forward to a peaceful Christmas together. But strange and unsettling currents had been moving beneath the surface of their lives. Small, discordant notes in the melody of their domestic world, which, in retrospect, would seem like dark omens. Months before that fateful Christmas, an insurance salesman had visited the Sodder home. He had tried to sell George a life insurance policy, but George had refused. The salesman became unusually hostile, warning George that his house would one day go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. He made a chilling parting remark, blaming George's outspoken anti-Mussolini sentiments. The threat was so stark that George never forgot it. Around the same time, another stranger had appeared at the property, asking for hauling work. When he was turned away, he walked to the back of the house and pointed to the 2 fuse boxes, warning George that they were going to cause a fire someday. George was puzzled. He had just had the house completely rewired, and the local power company had pronounced it safe. And in the weeks leading up to Christmas, the older Sodder children noticed a strange car parked along the main highway, its occupant intently watching the younger children as they walked home from school. These were threads of unease, but they were dismissed as the strange, isolated incidents that happen in any life, threads that would only be woven into a terrifying tapestry by the events to come. On the evening of Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sodder house was filled with the festive spirit. Marion had given her younger siblings new toys she had bought from her job at a local dime store, and the children were buzzing with excitement. The younger ones, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, begged to be allowed to stay up later than usual to play. Their mother, Jenny, agreed, on the condition that they remember to feed the cows and close the chicken coop before they went to bed. George and their 2 eldest sons, John and George Jr., who had spent the day working, were already asleep in their upstairs bedrooms. Around 12:30 in the morning, the telephone rang. Jenny went downstairs to answer it. On the other end was a woman whose voice she did not recognize, asking for a name she did not know. When Jenny told the woman she had reached a wrong number, she heard the sound of strange laughter and glasses clinking in the background before the caller hung up. Jenny thought little of it, assuming it was just a simple mistake from a noisy party somewhere. On her way back to bed, she noticed that the lights were still on and the front door was unlocked. She saw her daughter Marion, asleep on the living room couch, and assumed the other children who had stayed up were now in their beds in the attic. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and returned to her own bedroom, falling into a sleep that would be shattered only an hour later. At 1 in the morning, she was awoken by a sound she would never forget, a sharp, loud thud on the roof of the house, followed by a rolling noise, like an object clattering down the shingles. A half hour after that, she woke up again, this time to the smell of smoke. The house was on fire. George's office, located in a small room on the ground floor, was ablaze. Jenny screamed, waking George, and the house descended into a chaos of fire, smoke, and frantic desperation. George and Jenny and 4 of their children, who were on the ground floor, or easily accessible Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., managed to escape the burning house into the frigid night air. But upstairs, in the attic bedrooms, were the other 5, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. The parents screamed for them, their voices swallowed by the roar of the flames. The central staircase that led to the attic had become a raging inferno, cutting off any path from the inside. Panic set in as George began a desperate series of attempts to reach his children from the outside. His first thought was the heavy ladder he always kept propped against the side of the house. It was his emergency plan, a way to reach the second-story windows. But when he ran to the spot where it always stood, it was gone. It had inexplicably vanished. His next frantic idea was to use one of his 2 large coal trucks. He planned to drive one right up to the house and climb on top of it to get to the attic window. But when he jumped into the cab of the first truck and turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. He tried the second truck. It too was dead. Both trucks had been working perfectly the day before. It was as if the house and everything around it was conspiring against them. While George battled with the inert machinery, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department. She frantically dialed the number, but she couldn't get a response from the operator. Seeing the terrifying glow in the sky, another neighbor tried to call for help from a nearby tavern, but they also failed to get through to the operator. It was later discovered that the Sodders' telephone line had not burned through in the fire, as one might expect. It appeared to have been cut. Help was agonizingly slow to arrive. The fire department, led by Chief F. J. Morris, was located only 2.5 miles away. Yet, they did not arrive at the Sodder home until 8 o'clock in the morning, a full 7 hours after the fire had started. By then, there was nothing left to save. Proud, 2-story home had been reduced to a smoking, ash-filled basement. The official reason given for the delay was that the chief could not drive the fire truck because he needed to wait for a driver, and the phone tree system to summon other firefighters was not working. In the cold, gray light of Christmas morning, as a horrified crowd of onlookers gathered, the Sodder family stood staring at the smoldering ruins, their hearts shattered. George and Jenny assumed the worst, that their 5 beloved children had been trapped and had perished in the blaze. But as the day wore on, a new and even more disturbing mystery began to take shape. After only a cursory 2-hour search of the ashes, Fire Chief Morris delivered a baffling verdict. He told the grieving parents that they had not found a single bone, a single fragment of their children. He theorized that the fire, fueled by the home's timber and the coal stored in the basement, had been so intensely hot that it had completely cremated the bodies, leaving nothing behind. The official cause of the fire was listed as faulty wiring. The death certificates for the 5 children were issued just 4 days later. The case was considered closed. But for Jenny Sodder, the official explanation felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. She could not comprehend how 5 children could simply vanish into ash without a trace. She began to conduct her own simple, heartbreaking experiments, burning small animal bones in a bucket to see if they would be destroyed. They never were. They were always charred, but they remained. She spoke to an employee at a local crematorium who confirmed her suspicions, telling her that human bones remain even after a body is burned at 2,000 degrees for over 2 hours, a temperature far hotter and a duration far longer than any house fire. A seed of doubt, a seed that would grow into a lifelong obsession, was planted. What if their children hadn't died in the fire? What if the strange phone call, the missing ladder, the dead trucks, and the cut phone line were not a series of bizarre coincidences, but evidence of something far more sinister. What if the fire had been a deliberate act, a diversion to cover a kidnapping? George and Jenny's grief transformed into a relentless quest for answers. They refused to accept the official story. George used a bulldozer to cover the basement of the ruined home with 5 feet of dirt, vowing to preserve the site and turn it into a memorial garden for his lost children. He and Jenny began to challenge the authorities, pointing out the inconsistencies in the official report. They questioned why, if the fire was caused by faulty wiring, their Christmas lights had remained on during the early stages of the blaze. They found a telephone repairman who confirmed their line had been cut, not burned. And then a crucial piece of evidence from the night of the fire emerged. A bus driver who passed through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve claimed to have seen people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder house. A few years later, Jenny was clearing weeds from the memorial garden when she found a small, hard, dark green object. It was identified by experts as the outer casing of a pineapple-style hand grenade, or an incendiary bomb, lending credence to the theory that the fire was deliberately set. The Sodders hired a private investigator from Washington, D.C., named C. Tinsley. Tinsley unearthed a disturbing story that seemed to point to a cover-up. He discovered that Fire Chief Morris had apparently found something in the ashes and buried it. Tinsley confronted the chief, who admitted he had found what he believed to be a heart in the debris. He claimed he had buried it in a metal box at the site in a secret attempt to spare the family more pain. Tinsley persuaded him to dig it up. The box was exhumed and taken to a local funeral director, who determined the heart was, in fact, fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. The bizarre discovery suggested that Chief Morris had either concocted the story to try and placate the family with false evidence of their children's passing, or was part of a much deeper and more sinister deception. Tinsley also learned that the insurance salesman who had threatened George Sodder had, by a strange coincidence, served on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident. As the years stretched on, the Sodders' hope was kept alive by a series of tantalizing and heartbreaking clues. They erected a large, haunting billboard on Route 16, featuring the photos of their 5 missing children and offering a reward for information. The billboard became a local landmark, a constant public reminder of their unanswered question, and it stood for over 30 years. Then came the sightings. A woman who ran a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed she saw the children in the week after the fire. She said she served breakfast to them at her establishment, and that they were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian extraction. They were in a car with Florida license plates. The woman said she tried to speak to the children, but one of the men turned and gave her a hostile look, and the group promptly left. Another report came from a woman in St. Louis, Missouri, who wrote to the Sodders claiming that their eldest missing daughter, Martha, was living in a convent there. A patron at a hotel in Charleston claimed to have seen the children and said that one of the 2 women with them would not permit me to speak to the children, and became very unfriendly. George Sodder traveled to investigate many of these leads himself, but they always led to dead ends. The most famous and perplexing clue arrived in 1967, more than 20 years after the fire. Jenny Sodder received a letter in the mail, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his mid to late 20s who bore a striking resemblance to her son Louis, who would have been in his 30s at the time. He had the same dark, curly hair, dark eyes, and facial structure. On the back of the photo was a cryptic, handwritten note. Louis Sodder. I love Brother Frankie. Illeal boys. A 90,000 132 or 35. The family was baffled but electrified. They hired another private detective to go to Kentucky and investigate the letter's origin. The detective took their money, traveled to Kentucky, and was never heard from again. The Sodders added the updated photo of Lewis to their billboard, but the message on the back was never deciphered. George Sodder passed away in 1969, and Jenny passed away in 1989. They went to their graves without ever knowing for certain what happened to their 5 children. After Jenny's death, the family finally took down the weathered, time-worn billboard. The surviving children and their descendants have continued the search, but no definitive answers have ever been found. The theories remain. Was it an accident? A tragic series of improbable mishaps? The evidence makes this seem almost impossible. Was it an act of revenge by the Sicilian mafia, targeting George for his anti-Mussolini views, or for refusing to be extorted? This theory could explain the professionalism of the abduction and the silence of the local community. Or was it something else? A personal grudge so deep that it led someone to commit an almost unthinkable crime? The story of the Sodder children is not about a fire. It is about the unending, agonizing torment of uncertainty. It is about a question that burned hotter and longer than any flame. Did Maurice, Martha, Lewis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder perish on that cold Christmas night? Or were they stolen from their home to live out their lives somewhere else under different names, perhaps never knowing the full story of the family that never, for a single day, stopped searching for them? The memorial garden where their home once stood is gone now, but the question still hangs in the air of the West Virginia hills, a heartbreaking, unsolved American mystery. From the lingering, smoke-filled question of a West Virginia hillside, our search for answers now carries us across the vast, cold expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. We travel back in time to the very dawn of the 20th century, to a place of profound and desolate isolation. Our destination is a remote and rugged cluster of rocks known as the Flannan Isles, lying some 20 miles off the western coast of Scotland. Here, amidst the relentless crash of waves and the cry of seabirds, stands a solitary lighthouse, a stoic sentinel built to guard ships from the treacherous coastline. It was in this place, in the final, storm-lashed weeks of the year 1900, that a mystery would unfold, a story so quiet and so utterly baffling that it would become a permanent fixture in maritime lore, a ghost story whispered by sailors for over a century. The Islay Moor Lighthouse, standing on the largest of the 7 rocky isles, was a marvel of Victorian engineering and a testament to the human will to tame the wildness of the sea. It was a new installation, having only been lit for the first time a year earlier. For the sailors navigating these dangerous waters, its powerful beam was a welcome sight, a promise of safety and guidance. The lighthouse was manned by a rotating crew of 4 keepers, with 3 always on duty at the station and 1 on shore leave. It was a lonely, demanding job, a life of strict routine governed by the turning of the lamp and the changing of the tides. The men who took on this duty were known to be hardy, reliable, and deeply experienced seamen, men who understood the unforgiving nature of the North Atlantic. In December of 1900, the 3 men stationed at Islay Moor were Thomas Marshall, a seasoned mariner with decades of experience, James Ducat, another veteran keeper, and Donald MacArthur, a younger but equally tough seaman who was serving as the occasional keeper. They were all men of good character, known for their diligence and their quiet professionalism. Their life on the rock was one of meticulous record-keeping and maintenance. Every detail of the weather, the state of the equipment, and any passing ships was logged with precision in the lighthouse records. It was this adherence to routine that would make its sudden, unexplained cessation all the more terrifying. The first sign that something was amiss came on December 15th. The steamer Arkstor, making its passage from Philadelphia to Leith, noted in its own log that the Flannan Isles light was not operational. In the midst of a severe storm, the guiding beam was dark. This was a serious issue, a danger to any ship in the area. Upon docking, the captain of the Arctur dutifully reported the outage to the Northern Lighthouse Board. However, due to a combination of bureaucratic delay and the ferocity of the ongoing storms that battered the coast, a relief vessel was not immediately dispatched. For 11 days, the lighthouse remained dark and silent, its purpose unfulfilled, its keeper's fate unknown. Finally, on December 26th, the relief vessel, the Hesperus, made its way to the island under the command of Captain James Harvey. The ship carried Joseph Moore, the fourth keeper, who was returning from his shore leave to relieve one of his colleagues. As the Hesperus approached the island, an unnerving stillness seemed to hang over the place. The crew noted that the usual flag was not flying from the mast. There was no sign of any of the keepers waiting on the landing stage to welcome them, a standard and required procedure. Captain Harvey sounded the ship's horn and fired a flare to attract attention, but the island remained silent and unresponsive. The only sound was the crash of the waves and the mournful cry of the gulls. A deep sense of foreboding settled over the crew. Joseph Moore, his anxiety growing with every passing moment, was rowed ashore in a small boat as he climbed the steep rock-hewn steps leading up to the lighthouse compound. The silence felt heavy and unnatural. He reached the main entrance and found the door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the cold. The hearth was dark, the fire long dead. In the entrance hall, 2 of the 3 oilskin coats were missing. One, belonging to Donald MacArthur, was still hanging on its peg. This suggested that 2 of the men had gone outside, but one had remained behind. He continued into the living quarters. In the kitchen, he found a meal of salted mutton and potatoes laid out on the table, as if it had been prepared and then suddenly abandoned. An overturned chair lay on the floor, a single, stark piece of evidence that suggested a moment of sudden haste or panic. The clock on the wall had stopped. Moore moved through the rest of the lighthouse, his calls echoing in the empty rooms. The beds were unmade, a small but unsettling departure from the keeper's normally tidy habits. He checked the lamp room at the top of the tower. The lamp was clean and ready, the brass polished, and the reservoirs filled with oil. Everything was in perfect order, waiting for a hand to light the wick, a hand that was no longer there. Shaken, Moore returned to the landing stage and relayed his findings to Captain Harvey. The captain then came ashore with several other crewmen to conduct a more thorough search. They scoured every inch of the small, rocky island, but found no trace of the 3 keepers. They had vanished. The only other clues were found at the western landing platform. Here, the evidence of the recent storm's power was immense. A supply box had been smashed open, its contents strewn across the rocks. Iron railings that lined the path had been bent and twisted out of shape, and a massive block of stone, weighing more than a ton, had been dislodged and moved. Ropes that were usually coiled and secured in a crane were scattered across the platform, a chaotic mess that spoke of a desperate struggle against the elements. Captain Harvey sent a grim telegram back to the mainland. It read, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon, no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Fired a rocket, but as no response was made, managed to land Moore, who went up to the station, but found no keepers there. The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows. They must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. The official investigation, led by Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the lighthouse board, concluded that the men had been swept away by a freak wave. His theory was that on the evening of December 15th, during a lull in the storm, Thomas Marshall and James Ducat had gone down to the western landing to secure the equipment that was being battered by the unusually high seas. He surmised that the younger keeper, Donald MacArthur, had been left in the lighthouse, but, seeing his colleagues in trouble, had run out to help them without even stopping to grab his coat. A massive, unexpected wave then crashed over the platform, washing all three men into the churning Atlantic, their bodies never to be seen again. This became the official and most widely accepted explanation. It was a plausible, if tragic, scenario. But for many, this explanation felt incomplete, a neat and tidy answer to a mystery that was anything but. Several details stubbornly refused to fit the official narrative. First, it was a strict rule of the lighthouse board that one keeper must man the station at all times. It was almost unthinkable that all three experienced men would have abandoned their post simultaneously, for any reason. The idea that MacArthur would run out without his coat in the middle of a brutal December storm also seemed unlikely for a seasoned mariner. Furthermore, the logbook entries leading up to their disappearance contained strange, cryptic notes. On December 12th, Thomas Marshall had written of severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. He noted that James Ducat had been very quiet, and that Donald MacArthur had been crying. This was extraordinary behavior for these hardened men. Why would a storm, no matter how severe, reduce a tough sailor to tears? On December 13th, the log noted that the storm was still raging and that all three men were praying. Again, while the men were religious, the formal logging of prayer suggested a level of fear and desperation that went beyond a simple storm. The final entry, on December 15th, was short and strange. It simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." If the storm had ended, why would the men have needed to go down to the landing to secure equipment? And if the sea was calm, how could a freak wave have appeared and washed them away? The official investigation later dismissed these log entries, claiming they were forgeries or misinterpretations, but they remain a central and haunting part of the mystery. Over the decades, in the absence of a definitive answer, theories have flourished, ranging from the plausible to the paranormal. Some have suggested that the men were taken by foreign spies or pirates, though there was no political or logical reason for such an act. Others have speculated about a fight breaking out among the keepers. Perhaps one man, in a fit of rage, killed the other two, and then, consumed by guilt, threw himself into the sea. The overturned chair in the kitchen is often cited as evidence for this theory. But the men had good working relationships, and there was no history of violence among them. More outlandish theories speak of supernatural forces. The Flannan Isles have a long history of strange folklore. They were known to the old sailors as the Other Country, a place believed to be inhabited by spirits or fairies. Some have suggested the men were taken by a sea serpent or some other monstrous creature from the deep. Others believe they were abducted by a ghost ship or even an alien spacecraft. These theories, while fanciful, speak to the profound sense of wrongness that surrounds the case, the feeling that no conventional explanation is sufficient to explain the complete and total disappearance of three men from a locked room on a remote rock. The mystery of the Flannan Isles is a perfect, sealed room puzzle set on a stage of elemental fury. It is a story about the awesome power of the ocean and the vulnerability of the men who make their living upon it. But it is also a story about the unsettling power of silence. The most chilling aspect of the case is not the evidence that was found, but the evidence that was missing. No bodies, no final log entry explaining their actions, no answers. Just an empty lighthouse, a stopped clock, and an uneaten meal. The Alien Moorlight was remanned and automated years ago, but the story of its first keepers endures. Their fate remains a quiet, haunting question mark, a story that has become as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the waves themselves, a permanent, ghostly echo in the lonely cry of the sea. From the frozen, desolate slopes of the Ural Mountains, our journey takes a sharp turn, traveling south across the globe to the warm, tropical landscape of Brazil. We move forward in time to the year 1966, a period of political upheaval in Brazil, which was then under a military dictatorship. It was a time of secrets, of censorship, and of a general atmosphere of public distrust. It is against this backdrop of suspicion and unease that one of the strangest and most surreal mysteries in the annals of crime would unfold. This is not a story of a violent struggle or a desperate flight, but one of quiet, ritualistic strangeness. A case that feels less like a police report and more like a discarded page from a science fiction novel. It is known as the Lead Masks case. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, a young boy was flying a kite on the slopes of a hill known as Morro do Vintum, or Vintum Hill, in the city of Niterói, just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. The hill was a remote and rugged place, covered in dense vegetation and not frequently visited. While searching for his fallen kite, the boy stumbled upon a truly bizarre and unsettling scene. Lying in a small, cleared patch of brush were the remains of two men. They were lying side by side, partially covered by grass. Frightened, the boy ran home and told his parents, who then alerted the police. Because of the difficult terrain and the encroaching darkness, the authorities were not able to reach the site until the next day. When the police and a small crowd of reporters finally ascended Vintum Hill on August 21st, they were confronted with a scene that was meticulously strange. The two men were dressed in identical, formal business suits and waterproof coats. They were lying neatly on their backs, next to each other, on a bed of cleared leaves and branches. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious wounds, and no evidence of violence of any kind. Next to them was an empty water bottle, a small packet containing 2 towels, and a notebook. But the most baffling and iconic detail of the scene was found on the faces of the men. Each one was wearing a crude, smoothly cut mask made of lead, shaped like a pair of primitive spectacles, with no holes for the eyes. The 2 men were soon identified as Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jos Viana, 2 electronics technicians from the nearby city of Campos dos Goitacazes, a town several hours away. They were both married men with families, known to be respectable, hardworking, and deeply interested in science, electronics, and a fringe belief system that blended science fiction, spiritualism, and ufology. They were, by all accounts, scientific spiritualists, part of a small, obscure community that believed it was possible to communicate with extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings. The investigation into their final days revealed a strange and purposeful journey. On August 17th, 4 days before they were found, Manuel and Miguel told their families they were traveling to São Paulo to buy electronic components for their business, as well as a car. This was a plausible story, and they left with a significant amount of cash, the equivalent of about 2,000 US dollars. But they did not go to São Paulo. Instead, they boarded a bus to neither eye. They arrived in the city in the early afternoon. From there, the trail of clues becomes a series of strange, mundane purchases. They stopped at a bar and bought a bottle of mineral water, the same bottle that was found at the scene. A waitress at the bar later recalled that Miguel seemed very nervous and was constantly checking his watch. Their final stop was at a small shop where they purchased the 2 waterproof coats they were found wearing. This was their last known interaction. From there, they ascended Vint M. Hill for reasons that remain entirely unknown. The autopsy performed on the 2 men only deepened the mystery. The medical examiner could find no discernible cause for their passing. There were no signs of poisoning, no internal injuries, no evidence of assault. Due to the heavy workload and poor conditions at the local morgue, their internal organs were not tested for toxins in a timely manner, a critical failure in the investigation that meant a subtle poison could have been missed. In the absence of any other explanation, the cause was simply listed as undetermined, with the possibility of cardiac arrest being noted. But the idea that 2 healthy men, one 32 and the other 34, would both spontaneously suffer fatal heart attacks at the same time, in the same place, seemed statistically impossible. The focus of the investigation then shifted to the small notebook found at the scene. Inside were a series of cryptic, numbered instructions, written in a neat hand. The notes read, 16:30, be at the agreed place. 18:30, ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals, await mask signal. This strange set of commands seemed to be a schedule for some kind of ritual or experiment. The reference to capsules immediately suggested that the men had willingly ingested some kind of substance, perhaps a powerful hallucinogen or a poison, as part of their plan. The instruction to protect metals remains completely baffling. But the final command, to await mask signal, seemed to directly reference the bizarre lead masks they were wearing. What signal were they waiting for? And what did the masks protect them from? The investigation into the men's lives revealed that they were part of a small group of scientific spiritualists in their hometown. They and their friends would conduct strange experiments in their backyards, attempting to build devices to communicate with other worlds. One such experiment involved an explosion that angered their neighbors. Their interest seemed to be focused on achieving a form of spiritual contact through intense light and sound. A friend of the 2 men, a man named Elcio Gomez, later told police that they were part of a secret group that believed in the possibility of contact with aliens. He said that Miguel had spoken of a secret mission and that the purpose of the lead masks was to protect their eyes from the intense radiation that would be emitted during this encounter. This led to the prevailing theory that Manuel and Miguel had traveled to Vintum Hill to participate in a prearranged contact with an extraterrestrial or interdimensional entity. They had followed a set of instructions, ingested a substance they believed would facilitate this contact, and put on the lead masks to shield themselves from the anticipated spiritual or radioactive energy. In this scenario, their passing was an accident. Perhaps the capsules they took were a deadly poison, sold to them by a con artist who was preying on their beliefs. Or perhaps they were a powerful psychedelic that, combined with the excitement and exertion of the climb, induced fatal heart attacks. The theory of an otherworldly encounter, however, has never fully faded away. Several residents living near Vint M. Hill reported seeing a strange, brightly glowing, orange-colored object hovering over the hill on the night the 2 men were believed to have passed away. The object was described as egg-shaped and was said to have emitted powerful beams of light. This UFO sighting, though unconfirmed, has become a central part of the case's mythology, suggesting to some that Manuel and Miguel were not mistaken, that they did, in fact, encounter something on that hilltop, and that this encounter was fatal. The lead mask's case is a perfect enigma. Every clue seems to lead only to more questions. What were the capsules they ingested? What was the mask signal they were waiting for? Who gave them their instructions? Were they the victims of a cruel hoax, or did they succeed in their quest, paying the ultimate price for making contact with the unknown? The case is a strange fusion of the mundane and fantastic. The bus tickets, the water bottle, the raincoats, these are the ordinary artifacts of a simple trip. But the lead masks, the cryptic notebook, and the UFO sightings belong to another world entirely. The two men who lay on that lonely hilltop were not simply victims of a crime. They were participants in a mystery of their own making. They embarked on a journey to the very edge of human understanding, and somewhere on that quiet hill, under the strange protection of their leaden masks, they crossed a final threshold and never returned. From the frozen, desolate slopes of the Ural Mountains, our journey takes a sharp turn, traveling south across the globe to the warm, tropical landscape of Brazil. We move forward in time to the year 1966, a period of political upheaval in Brazil, which was then under a military dictatorship. It was a time of secrets, of censorship, and of a general atmosphere of public distrust. It is against this backdrop of suspicion and unease that one of the strangest and most surreal mysteries in the annals of crime would unfold. This is not a story of a violent struggle or a desperate flight, but one of quiet, ritualistic strangeness. A case that feels less like a police report and more like a discarded page from a science fiction novel. It is known as the lead masks case. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, a young boy was flying a kite on the slopes of a hill known as Morro do Vintum, or Vintum Hill, in the city of Niterói, just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. The hill was a remote and rugged place, covered in dense vegetation and not frequently visited. While searching for his fallen kite, the boy stumbled upon a truly bizarre and unsettling scene. Lying in a small, cleared patch of brush were the remains of two men. They were lying side by side, partially covered by grass. Frightened, the boy ran home and told his parents, who then alerted the police. Because of the difficult terrain and the encroaching darkness, the authorities were not able to reach the site until the next day. When the police and a small crowd of reporters finally ascended Vintum Hill on August 21st, they were confronted with a scene that was meticulously strange. The two men were dressed in identical, formal business suits and waterproof coats. They were lying neatly on their backs, next to each other, on a bed of cleared leaves and branches. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious wounds, and no evidence of violence of any kind. Next to them was an empty water bottle, a small packet containing 2 towels, and a notebook. But the most baffling and iconic detail of the scene was found on the faces of the men. Each one was wearing a crude, smoothly cut mask made of lead, shaped like a pair of primitive spectacles, with no holes for the eyes. The two men were soon identified as Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Josviana, 2 electronics technicians from the nearby city of Campos dos Goitacazes, a town several hours away. They were both married men with families, known to be respectable, hardworking, and deeply interested in science, electronics, and a fringe belief system that blended science fiction, spiritualism, and ufology. They were, by all accounts, scientific spiritualists, part of a small, obscure community that believed it was possible to communicate with extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings. The investigation into their final days revealed a strange and purposeful journey. On August 17th, 4 days before they were found, Manuel and Miguel told their families they were traveling to São Paulo to buy electronic components for their business, as well as a car. This was a plausible story, and they left with a significant amount of cash, the equivalent of about 2,000 US dollars. But they did not go to São Paulo. Instead, they boarded a bus to Niter I. They arrived in the city in the early afternoon. From there, the trail of clues becomes a series of strange, mundane purchases. They stopped at a bar and bought a bottle of mineral water, the same bottle that was found at the scene. A waitress at the bar later recalled that Miguel seemed very nervous and was constantly checking his watch. Their final stop was at a small shop where they purchased the 2 waterproof coats they were found wearing. This was their last known interaction. From there, they ascended Vint M. Hill for reasons that remain entirely unknown. The autopsy performed on the 2 men only deepened the mystery. The medical examiner could find no discernible cause for their passing. There were no signs of poisoning, no internal injuries, no evidence of assault. Due to the heavy workload and poor conditions at the local morgue, their internal organs were not tested for toxins in a timely manner, a critical failure in the investigation that meant a subtle poison could have been missed. In the absence of any other explanation, the cause was simply listed as undetermined, with the possibility of cardiac arrest being noted. But the idea that 2 healthy men, one 32 and the other 34, would both spontaneously suffer fatal heart attacks at the same time, in the same place, seemed statistically impossible. The focus of the investigation then shifted to the small notebook found at the scene. Inside were a series of cryptic, numbered instructions, written in a neat hand. The notes read, 16:30, be at the agreed place. 18:30, ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals, await mask signal. This strange set of commands seemed to be a schedule for some kind of ritual or experiment. The reference to capsules immediately suggested that the men had willingly ingested some kind of substance, perhaps a powerful hallucinogen or a poison, as part of their plan. The instruction to protect metals remains completely baffling. But the final command, to await mask signal, seemed to directly reference the bizarre lead masks they were wearing. What signal were they waiting for? And what did the masks protect them from? The investigation into the men's lives revealed that they were part of a small group of scientific spiritualists in their hometown. They and their friends would conduct strange experiments in their backyards, attempting to build devices to communicate with other worlds. One such experiment involved an explosion that angered their neighbors. Their interest seemed to be focused on achieving a form of spiritual contact through intense light and sound. A friend of the 2 men, a man named Elcio Gomez, later told police that they were part of a secret group that believed in the possibility of contact with aliens. He said that Miguel had spoken of a secret mission and that the purpose of the lead masks was to protect their eyes from the intense radiation that would be emitted during this encounter. This led to the prevailing theory that Manuel and Miguel had traveled to Vintum Hill to participate in a prearranged contact with an extraterrestrial or interdimensional entity. They had followed a set of instructions, ingested a substance they believed would facilitate this contact, and put on the lead masks to shield themselves from the anticipated spiritual or radioactive energy. In this scenario, their passing was an accident. Perhaps the capsules they took were a deadly poison, sold to them by a con artist who was preying on their beliefs. Or perhaps they were a powerful psychedelic that, combined with the excitement and exertion of the climb, induced fatal heart attacks. The theory of an otherworldly encounter, however, has never fully faded away. Several residents living near Vint M. Hill reported seeing a strange, brightly glowing, orange-colored object hovering over the hill on the night the two men were believed to have passed away. The object was described as egg-shaped and was said to have emitted powerful beams of light. This UFO sighting, though unconfirmed, has become a central part of the case's mythology, suggesting to some that Manuel and Miguel were not mistaken, that they did, in fact, encounter something on that hilltop, and that this encounter was fatal. The lead masks case is a perfect enigma. Every clue seems to lead only to more questions. What were the capsules they ingested? What was the mask signal they were waiting for? Who gave them their instructions? Were they the victims of a cruel hoax, or did they succeed in their quest, paying the ultimate price for making contact with the unknown? The case is a strange fusion of the mundane and fantastic. The bus tickets, the water bottle, the raincoats, these are the ordinary artifacts of a simple trip. But the lead masks, the cryptic notebook, and the UFO sightings belong to another world entirely. The two men who lay on that lonely hilltop were not simply victims of a crime. They were participants in a mystery of their own making. They embarked on a journey to the very edge of human understanding, and somewhere on that quiet hill, under the strange protection of their leaden masks, they crossed a final threshold and never returned. We leave the surreal, ritualistic scene on a Brazilian hillside and travel to our final destination, a place where the mystery is not written in the sky, but on a single, tiny scrap of paper. We journey to the sun-drenched coast of Australia, to the city of Adelaide in the year 1948. The world was still piecing itself back together after the Second World War, and the new, icy tensions of the Cold War were beginning to take hold. It was an era of spies, of secret codes, and of hidden identities. It is in this atmosphere of quiet paranoia and global secrets that a man would be found on a quiet beach, a man with no name, no past, and a single cryptic clue that would launch one of the most enduring and romanticized mysteries of all time. This is the case of the Somerton Man. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, at 6:30 a.m., the remains of a man were discovered on Somerton Park Beach, just south of Adelaide. He was lying in the sand, propped up against a seawall, in a relaxed, almost peaceful position. He was dressed impeccably in a white shirt, a tie, a pair of brown trousers, and a smart, double-breasted suit jacket. His shoes were clean and polished, despite his location on a sandy beach. He was a man in his early 40s, in peak physical condition, with broad shoulders and a narrow waist. There were no signs of violence or struggle. In his pockets were a few mundane items: an unused train ticket to a nearby suburb, a bus ticket, a comb, a packet of chewing gum, and a pack of Army Club cigarettes that contained 7 cigarettes of another, more expensive brand called Kensitas. There was no wallet, no cash, and most importantly, no identification of any kind. All the labels on his clothing had been meticulously cut away. The police were baffled. The man was a complete cipher. The initial autopsy, conducted by a respected pathologist named Sir John Burton Cleland, could not determine a cause of passing. There was no evidence of poison, though Cleland suspected it was the most likely cause, perhaps one that was fast-acting and difficult to trace. He noted several unusual physical features. The man's calf muscles were high and well-developed, like those of a ballet dancer or someone who frequently wore heeled boots. His toes were strangely wedge-shaped, but these were just peculiar details, not answers. The man's fingerprints were run through records in Australia and then sent abroad, but no match was ever found. His dental records were unique and did not match any existing files. He was, for all official purposes, a ghost. The case grew stranger. Months later, on January 14th, 1949, a brown suitcase was discovered, checked into the luggage room of the Adelaide railway station. The suitcase had been checked in on the morning of November 30th, the day before the man was found. The police believed it belonged to him. Inside, they found more clothing, all with the labels removed. However, they did find a name written on 3 of the items: T. Keen or Kian. The police believed this was a red herring, that the clothes did not belong to the man, or that the name was an alias. The search for anyone named T. Keen with a missing relative turned up nothing. The suitcase also contained a stenciling kit of the type used by merchant seamen to mark cargo, and a thread card of orange waxed thread, which was not commercially available in Australia, and was identical to the thread used to repair a pocket on the man's trousers. The contents of the suitcase only deepened the mystery of his profession. Was he a sailor? A military man? Something else entirely? For months, the case remained cold. The unidentified man was embalmed to preserve his remains, and a plaster cast was made of his head and shoulders. He became a local obsession, the mystery man of Somerton. Then, in April of 1949, a new search of the man's clothing revealed a tiny, hidden fob pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers. And inside that pocket was the clue that would define the case forever. It was a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of paper, printed with 2 words in a distinctive, ornate font, Tamam Shud. The phrase was identified by experts at the local library. It was Persian, and it meant it is ended or it is finished. The scrap of paper had been torn from the final page of a very specific book, a collection of poems called The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The police launched a nationwide appeal to find the exact copy of the book from which the page had been torn. The appeal reached a man in the nearby town of Glenelg. He came forward with a rare first edition copy of the book, translated by Edward Fitzgerald. He told police that on the night of November 30th, the night before the body was found, his car had been parked near Somerton Beach. He had found the book tossed into the back seat of his unlocked car. He thought little of it at the time, but after seeing the police appeal, he checked the book. The final page, containing the words Tamam Shud, had been torn out. The scrap of paper found on the Somerton man was a perfect match. This was a major breakthrough. But the book contained even more secrets. In the back, written faintly in pencil, were 5 lines of capital letters. It appeared to be a code. They were nonsensical, a jumble that cryptographers from the Australian Department of Defense and countless amateurs since have been unable to decipher. Was it a message? A list of names? A secret formula? The code remains, to this day, unbroken. The book contained one final, tantalizing clue. Also written in the back was a telephone number. The number belonged to a young nurse who lived on Mosley Street in Glenelg, just a short walk from where the man's remains were found. The police, led by Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean, interviewed the woman. Her name was Jessica Jo Thompson. She was evasive and seemed deeply distressed by the investigation. She denied knowing the Somerton man and claimed to have no idea why her phone number would be in his book. However, she did admit that she had once owned a copy of the Rubaiyat and had given it to a man she knew, an army lieutenant named Alfred Boxall, during the war. For a moment, the police thought they had solved the case. They located Alfred Boxall, alive and well, and still in possession of the copy of the Rubaiyat that Jessica had given him. Crucially, his copy was intact. The final page with Tamam Shud had not been torn out. It was the wrong book. The Somerton man was not Alfred Boxall. When the police showed Jessica Thompson the plaster cast of the Somerton man's face, her reaction was extreme. A witness described her as being completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. Yet, she still denied knowing him. She remained the most compelling and frustrating link to the man's identity, a link she seemed determined to keep secret. She took her secrets to the grave, passing away in 2007. In later years, her daughter would claim in interviews that she believed her mother did know the Somerton man, and that his identity was known to a level higher than the police force. She hinted that both her mother and the mystery man may have been Soviet spies. This theory, that the Somerton man was a spy, has become one of the most enduring. The era, the untraceable poison, the secret codes, the removed clothing labels at all points to the shadowy world of Cold War espionage. Was he a Soviet agent who had been compromised and silenced by his own side? Or was he a Western agent who had been assassinated by the enemy? The cryptic code in the book could have been his final, desperate message. The case of the Somerton man is the ultimate quiet enigma. It is a story with a body but no murder, a book with no reader, and a code with no key. Every clue that was discovered seemed to only deepen the shadows around him. He was a man who went to extraordinary lengths to erase his own existence, only to leave behind a trail of intricate and poetic clues. He remains, more than 70 years later, a complete unknown. In 2022, a researcher named Derek Abbott claimed to have finally identified the man as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne, using DNA analysis. However, this identification has not yet been officially confirmed by the South Australian police, and many questions about Webb's life and his connection to the case remain unanswered. Until that official confirmation comes, he remains the Somerton man. He is a testament to the fact that a person can walk through this world and leave behind nothing but a question. He lies now in a cemetery in Adelaide, under a simple headstone that reads, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach." The words Tamam Shud are not on the stone. For the man, his story was finished, but for the rest of the world, the mystery had just begun. And so, our journey through the shadows of the unexplained comes to a quiet close. We have walked through homes haunted by watchers and forests stalked by legends. We have stood before silent lighthouses and sifted through the cold ashes of a family's greatest loss. These stories linger, not because of their answers, but because of their profound and unending questions. Thank you for joining us in the twilight tonight. If these quiet mysteries have helped to calm your mind or guide you toward rest, we would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe for more tales from the Sleepy Detective. We invite you to share in the comments which story lingers with you the most. Until next time, may your thoughts be calm and may your sleep be peaceful.